Thanks, Rob. Thanks for inviting me. This is an area that I've been working in for some time. I work at the Wellcome Trust, who I'm assuming most of you know who the Wellcome Trust is, but I can explain to you. And if not, if you've never heard of them, you probably have seen them on the map that UCL produce now for how to get to this place, because it says Wellcome Collection, Wellcome Trust on the same map. And actually, if we have a fire drill at the Wellcome Trust, our congregation point is right out the front here, so we're kind of neighbours, very much neighbours. So basically, we're a bioscience funder, medical sciences, but we also fund research into bioethics and humanities in terms of the history of medicine and things like that. So we cover a huge range of bioscience kind of issues. Just in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm just going to give a little bit of context to the Wellcome Trust, because obviously the context of what we do and what we fund is key in terms of how we think about impact for our own organisation. Just a bit about what we do at the Wellcome Trust in terms of how we do monitoring and evaluation. I'm going to raise some of the issues that we face as a bioscience funders in terms of impact generally. I'm not sure whether I haven't been involved in the rest of the series that you've heard, so if it's things that you've heard before, I apologise, but hopefully it'll provide a different context, because it provides context to what we see as the problems and challenges with impact within the biosciences specifically, which are not unique to most fields, to be honest. Then I'm going to explain how we deal with that kind of issue at the Wellcome Trust and what we actually do practically and how we use evaluation and impact within the Trust. And then I'm just going to raise some issues about future agendas in terms of the whole impact agenda and some of the things that Rob talked about new metrics and what we are using and what we see as some of the kind of challenges for biosciences impact particularly. So that's kind of how I'm going to go today. For those of you who've not seen next door, if you look out the back, this is the Wellcome Trust. You can see this part of the building at the back. We're based in a building that belonged to Henry Wellcome. It's joined onto it. This is the original Wellcome building. This is still on the Eastern Road, joined to this building. He was a philanthropist, so we're an independent charity, formed in 1936 when he died. He basically left all his money to Trust. He had an interesting personal life and decided he wanted to leave all his money to Trust and research. So all the money was left into a research fund that is subsequently to be used for the improvement of human and animal health. So luckily we've got some great investment people, and they've kind of gone onwards and upwards, and we now have a lot of money to kind of invest in research each year. Our vision, as I mentioned, is really broad. We're about funding human and animal health, improvements in human and animal health. So it gives us a huge, big scope, which is great. And we do fund researchers across the whole spectrum. About 85% of our funds are spent in the UK, within the UK universities. But some of that money we also spend around 10 to 15%. It varies overseas at various research institutions in Africa and Asia, particularly. As I mentioned, we started in 1937 with, I haven't put these in real prices, but we had £73,048 in the bank in 1937. It's now worth £14 billion, so we are quite huge. We always used to say that we were the biggest research, independent biosciences research fund in the world until the Gates Foundation came onto the scene, and now we're not. So we're number 2 now, but we don't say that anymore. We just say we're a big medical research funder. But we do have quite a lot of asset base. What it means is that we spend around £650 million in research each year, and it makes us equivalent to the Medical Research Council in the UK. So we work quite closely with the MRC, who are obviously one of the government research councils here, and we have some alignments in the kind of impact work that we do because we're funding very similar areas and similar people. Sometimes there's quite a lot of overlap between people who have UK Medical Research Council funding and also Wellcome Trust funding. And the whole issue about reporting and telling us what you've done with our grants is kind of very overlapping, and we're all dealing with the same issues. Those are the types of grants we fund. I'll just brush over this briefly, but we have fellowships, we have project-based funding, we have large strategic awards, which might be buildings or career programmes, that kind of thing. And as I mentioned at the bottom, which are probably might be more relevant actually to people here, we do fund in sort of more socially sciences, so medical humanities and public engagement work is kind of key to what we do as well. So just in terms of the impact agenda, this is not a new thing, and I think the word impact agenda has kind of come right up the into the consciousness of researchers. basically, we've been doing this kind of work. Most funders have been doing this kind of work for some time. It's now called impact agenda in the past, and actually we still use this word. It's all about monitoring and evaluation. It's about finding out what we're doing with our money and how to use it in the best way. And that's kind of where I think the word impact agenda has kind of changed the way that we do things. And I actually don't think it has actually changed the rationale for why we do it. It's just how we do it is possibly changed. And we've always seen that monitoring and evaluation, I've got a definition there, is central to what we do. The issues around accountability and validation and audit that Rob mentioned at the start, even though we're an independent funder, we're not a government funder, we do have responsibilities to the taxpayers in the UK to sort of explain, and we get various tax breaks on the use of our money. We also are beholden to a charity commission in the UK. We have to say what we've done with the money, how we've spent it, and how we use it wisely. Evaluation and things around impact are kind of key for us to know how to manage funding schemes. If we can see certain schemes are delivering great things and they seem to be delivering particular types of things, and that's something we need to know. So it is of practical use. We do use that kind of information for how to rejig schemes or which schemes aren't working, which funding schemes might be working. We do use it for learning, for that purpose particularly, how we try to do future strategy. We do use it for where we go next, which relates to the next one, strategy and planning. We do reviews of areas, which ones seem to be producing interesting things, which ones don't, and that kind of thing. And we use it for policy and advocacy, which I sometimes feel a lot of this impact agenda has pushed evaluation work into you're demonstrating a case of how something's worked, rather than really trying to understand what it's for and how you can use it. And I think while that's important, it's important to have evidence of where research that you've funded has had an impact. We've got to be careful that that isn't the only thing that it becomes. So just in terms of how we structure ourselves, within the Wellcome Trust, the monitoring evaluation, and most funding agencies do this. They do various kind of reviews of individual grants, so it might be an end of grant report form, it might be an annual report form, and you collect various pieces of information that are important to you and that scheme. We do programme reviews where we do consultations with everyone who's had a grant on that programme. We do aggregated analysis, we do career tracking, things like that. We've been doing more scientific portfolio areas, so looking at an area of science or something that we funded over a 20-year period and taking a big kind of macro step back about what have been the key things that have happened out of that kind of work. And we use a lot of social science methodologies to do this kind of work. And then we also have a framework in place for us as an organisation, which basically sets out what are the key things that we are really interested in having an impact in or making a difference, and what are the key things that we need to know. And then we try to build that into the information we collect at every other stage. So it's kind of a interrelated system. But it is all about making information useful. This was when, in terms of my awareness of the impact agenda, this was one of the discussions that I was involved in about 6 years ago, where someone who was then at the Treasury, I think he's actually moved roles now, but this has kind of stayed with us, is that this was when impact agenda for the biosciences particularly came onto the table, that it was really important that the scientific community, in a time of austerity particularly, and this kind of preceded it in a way, there was a very clear statement to most biosciences and research funders in the UK that we really needed to be better at making the case for research. Why is it important? And everyone agrees that that's an important thing to say. There's different calls on government funding particularly. You've got to make the case. So everyone kind of sort of had a bit of a wake-up call. But what that turned into perhaps isn't quite as easy as to understand as actually what the actual impacts and how you track them actually is. So it kind of, I'm not quite sure the the consequences of what that statement and those kind of sentiments actually led to. So in the biosciences particularly, these are just some general things that we face. Again, it's probably the same in social science, but I thought I'd raise them because what we've been doing over the last few years is kind of exploring a little bit more about tracking impact through from piece of research to how it actually ends up being, or whether it has an impact at all. In the biosciences particularly, some research has been done to try and look at how long it takes for a particular piece of lab work to lead to something that is classed as an outcome or an impact on society or something like that. Two of the classic examples that you see in biomedicine is, so IVF is one of the classic ones that we use, and we've been doing the tracking of how long this has taken. So it was in the 1960s when Robert Edwards worked with, I can't remember his steptoe, to do the first cultivation of labs in eggs rather in a laboratory. So he first made an embryo in a laboratory cell in the 1960s. There was loads and loads of science that led to that being able to do. But in basically the early 1960s, and it's quite hard to pin down the exact date that actually happened. By 1978, we have the first IVF baby. So there's 18 years roughly between those 2 points. In terms of that being an impact, everyone thinks IVF obviously has led to lots of assisted conceptions and births, and there's, I don't know, millions of children now. I'm not actually sure how many, but lots of children born through this procedure. Robert Edwards received the Nobel Prize last year for that breakthrough. And interestingly, the reason why he didn't receive the Nobel Prize before that, even though that was 30 years previously, was because there was a monitoring of whether there were long-term effects on IVF children in terms of epidemiology. They were making sure that there was nothing wrong with IVF. There was a significant period of time before they decided, yeah, it's an absolutely fantastic thing worthy of the Nobel Prize. So if you take that whole span, it's kind of a long, long time. And that's kind of an extreme example, but it just shows you kind of how things can vary over time. Something that is considered a breakthrough in 2 years' time might not be a breakthrough. So there's kind of lots of things, nuances in the whole issue about discovery, and it's important to realise this. Another example at the bottom we use is something that, interestingly, neither of these Wellcome Trust funded, so we were a bit annoyed about that. We do also dig into these kind of case studies and look for where Wellcome Trust has had a major role, but unfortunately we picked two that we couldn't find any particular role. Monoclonal antibodies is another thing that is used in lots of treatment therapies now. And it took 30 years for that to be recognised as a really useful process. When it was first produced, there was no expectation that it would actually lead to anything in a therapeutic sense. So that's another good example of how things take a long time. And now, actually, in terms of economic impact, monoclonal antibodies in therapies are worth billions and billions of pounds to the pharmaceutical industry and governments and NHS savings in terms of illnesses. So if you looked at the economic impact of both those two, absolutely huge. The other one that we talk about quite a lot is the serendipity of science, and you get a lot of people who kick back on the whole impact agenda because of this issue. And most people fully acknowledge that it's absolutely true that you can't predict. If you can predict something's going to happen and you in advance, then why are you funding it in the first place? It's hardly risky. You don't need to do the research if it's that predictable. And that's a kind of extreme view on that. But the serendipity of science, you see a lot in biosciences. I'm sure you see it the same in social sciences. DNA fingerprinting is a good example of this. Not exactly a geneticist myself, but Alec Jeffrey basically discovered this because he left a dirty mark on a slide at the end of one of his experiments. And he thought, actually, every time we do this, this is unique, and he stumbled across it. He wasn't actually looking for anything to do with that. And now what that's actually led to is the revolutionisation of criminal science, forensic science. DNA fingerprinting is kind of integral to crime and investigation today. Interestingly, anecdotally, I've heard that he's not a great believer in DNA databases and things, but actually his discovery has kind of led to this. So all the ethics around DNA databases, it's kind of interesting that it's sort of a beast unleashed on something that he wasn't actually intended. But just in terms of, again, economic benefits, the impact on society, it's absolutely huge. Nothing to do with what he originally set out to do. So it's just an example of how things can spiral. Attribution and contribution. You see funders push this way quite a lot, and again, as an independent funder, we're kind of in a nice position to be able to sort of recognise what we're interested in is where we've had a big role. We know that we're not interested in just pinning down this is just our, we don't want to claim that something that we funded is all to do with us. Most researchers have been involved in the long road to discovery, or they're funded by multiple agencies, so sharing things between funders is absolutely sensible and realistic. We've been doing over the last few years timelines of the people that we funded. So this is the guy that Wellcome Trust has funded. We knew that he'd had a lot of Wellcome Trust funding, but what we tried to do with some of the researchers that we funded, partly to kind of explore where we come in. Does our funding seed something, or does it come in later? And we've got about 100 of these that we've been doing just to look at whether we're a seed funder or whether we're a late funder, and you can see why, as strategically, we'd be interested in doing that. But what you do is you dig into John Todd, and he's had lots of big grants from the Wellcome Trust, but when you actually look at the rest of his funding, he's actually had a load of other funding from loads of other people at the same time. So to try and say that his breakthroughs in diabetes, these is where his particular breakthroughs came through, he's a diabetes researcher. It's just not true. It's just not realistic. So we again are able to sort of say these are great things that we've contributed to, but just to put it on a map of how everybody links together is important. And again, you can kind of see how long it actually took from the late 80s to the breakthrough starting to come through. So that's another interesting thing about time lags and the realism of what science does over time frames. The other things that we look at, things like ripple effects, a bit like Alec Jeffrey's is a great example of a ripple effect. Something happens in one field, revolutionises another field. And it's quite hard to capture that through some of this sort of impact agenda stuff sometimes without actually spending a lot of resource trying to do that. We always get questioned by the Wellcome Trust governors is that, okay, we've had some really interesting stories coming out of this research. We know where the impact's been. But what would have happened if we hadn't funded it in the first place? And you get that question a lot. And in economics, you often get that kind of question about what would have happened if you hadn't done something, and the opportunity cost and things like that. I think the practical sense, in my view, is having worked in this field for quite a while, is can you really answer that question in any meaningful way? It's kind of, there are some areas where you can do that, but a lot of science, a lot of the biosciences, it's quite hard to know. You can look at whether somebody else has funded it and then it's gone on to do other things, but it's quite hard to pin down in any kind of precise way. One thing that I think a lot of the new metrics and the new impact area has been really useful for is trying to be better at recognising when you get negative findings, when something isn't going to revolutionise the world. When you prove something or you find something doesn't work, it's actually really important to try and get that out there. And a lot of the new impact agendas and open science is really starting to help that kind of way of making communication of negative findings, which I think everybody recognises is important. It's just traditionally been very hard through the traditional publication of peer review. It's been traditionally quite hard to publish that. So that's something that we think open science is actually starting to change views on. So I think, really, I mean, you've probably heard this lots before, and I don't want to raise problems rather than challenges. I think the main thing that we've found over, and you see with the impact agendas, is what's happened is that people are counting what they can measure, basically, and it becomes measurables, it becomes metrics, and metrics can be important. I'm not saying they're not important, and we use them at Wellcome, but we just need to balance it. We need to be very clear that what we're actually measuring is what's important. And I think Julie is going to talk about how to make metrics more scientific and usable, and the kind of thing we really need to know what is it that's important. And each funding agency is different. I put this quote. I quite like this quote, and it doesn't mean shoddy data. What it means is, to me, I basically take that to mean just because it's difficult to capture something doesn't mean you shouldn't try. I think you should try to do what we can, but what we need to do is make something and make it real to what you're actually trying to measure. So impact needs to be tailored to the kind of thing that you're looking at. So at the Wellcome Trust, over the last few years, we've been playing with various frameworks. I don't know if anyone has seen this. I don't know if anyone's raised sort of impact frameworks in previous seminars, but a few of you might have, or you might know about the logical framework that's used in rural development particularly. It was developed in that sort of area, and the Department for International Development use things like the logical framework to map through goals from projects to endpoints and set out what it is that's important throughout the stages of something that you're funding. This was something that's been used particularly in medical and health-related research in the UK particularly, although Canada have played with it a little bit, and I think the Australian government have played with it a little bit. And all they do, these are frameworks that basically help you set out what you think are likely to be the payback or the impact or whatever term you want to use from research. And a lot of funders have been using these kinds of examples of things. So knowledge production, you'd be looking for things like peer review publications and intellectual property, and they are things to count, but you just need to be careful about actually are they really important to what you're funding. So we've used that a little bit in the Wellcome Trust to influence what we've come up with. So we have something The other thing that we've done as well, we've moved away from the word success a little bit in a lot of our sort of terminology. So instead of saying, what does success look like, which is what you hear about, and then that's what the kind of impact stuff is. We've been using it because of the sort of incremental nature of a lot of what we fund. It's about progress. We actually want to know where our projects are making progress. So we've termed these our indicators of progress. So our outcomes are basically things that the Wellcome Trust as a funder wants to achieve. We want to make discoveries. We want to have trained brilliant people. We want to have research leaders who are able to then make subsequent discoveries. We want to have applications into healthcare sector. We want to have things that influence the way the government works. And then we've got indicators around those, and then we collect information based on those kind of things. Now we try to tailor that. We don't go too crazy with indicators, but these are our measures of how we're making progress, how the grants that we're funding are making progress. And this filters through to everything that we do in terms of the grants and stuff. So just as an example, I've used this in a previous talk. We were focusing on innovation, and these are some of our key things where we want to know where we're making innovation. So if we want to know if we're contributing to tangible impacts on health or developing enabling products and devices in the medical sector, the kinds of things that we'd be collecting and talking to our researchers to tell them this is what we want to know. We'd be looking at patent filing, we'd be looking at product licenses, but also from the numbers, we want a little bit more into what exactly is that. Is it inventions, number of translation awards, and when we've also got leverage of other funding from venture capitalists, that kind of information. And so, for example, you'd pin down, so you'd go from number of patents you've got on a grant, you'd look at whether there's any follow-up. If what we've also been doing is another quote that we use quite a lot is relates very much about being counted. So not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And again, we've been trying to develop some more qualitative stories that complement that output information. So the example of the translation award, which would be a numerical, you'd be looking at translation award, we'd also then look at each of those translation awards and actually see what it is that's important about that translation award. Is it something that really does have an impact? Is it actually something that's being used rather than just appearing on a report form? So this is an example of something that's actually had an actual uptake within a healthcare setting. One thing that I've noticed particularly in the impact agenda, is that lots of people have started to do, because of all the problems with metrics, and everybody understands the problems with metrics and counting and trying to sort of pin things down to an actual quantitative amount, is the whole issue of using qualitative narratives to complement that. And everybody, that's a good thing. I think we see that. The problem I've started to see, and I'm originally a social scientist, is that we've had case study creeps, and now what you see, you've almost got as many case studies as you've got in quantitative metrics. And what we found initially is an unstructured case study is pretty unique. You can't compare it across things. So what you've got to be really careful is how you use those, and how in some government circles we've seen some case studies really having an impact, because a good story of where something, it's quality not quantity, is really important. But in terms of analysis of that kind of case study, it's really hard for a funder, if we've got 600 of these, to actually then start to make a sense of the case studies in the same way that you wouldn't be able to make sense of, or you might want to pick holes in a piece of data. So what we've tried to do is make our case studies more structured, so really pin down in a few words what the impact is. And one of the things that we do want to do is a bit more content analysis on this whole raft of case studies we've now got, because then you can start to pull through whether there are themes in something that becomes a successful impact. And that's the kind of thing that you don't see very much of at the moment. And I always think that's a really useful impact agenda for some of the social science. If someone had a project to start looking through case studies, they'd be really interested in looking at that. That's something that you see. Case studies have become, that's almost the answer. Let's just do a case study to tell the story of it, and that's great, and it does do a good thing. But what you can't do is in a very aggregated way think about what the impacts have been on those stories. And that's just another example of an ancillary case study. The other issue with case studies is another quote. I like this quote because basically this guy there's been a history of lung surfactant and its use in pre-neonatal babies, and how it has actually revolutionised lifespan and neonatal survival. The story of how that came about was originally there was some work done in New Zealand on sheep, looking at sheep, and they did the research on lambs, and then it's subsequently been translated into babies, in human babies, and someone did a retrospective case study of how that had happened, a bit like we did with the IVF story. We looked back at how that had come about, and interestingly, even the man who sanctioned the story, signed off the story, he was involved in this at the start, did say, and this is a good comment, I think about the whole case study thing is sometimes glosses get put on things effectively, and you need to be careful about how rigorous they actually are as well, and everybody kind of knows that thing, but I just think that's what you do find. If you're asking someone to cast their mind back about the events of what led to this, you sometimes lose something in translation. And I think one of the messages that we always say with our researchers is we're trying to be very clear about what things are important to the Wellcome Trust, and I think funders are doing that a little bit more, so that if anyone who's got a grant from a funder at least knows from the start what kinds of information they need to start thinking about collecting on a prospective basis, instead of getting to the end of a grant and then thinking, what did I need to tell them, or what, and that kind of thing. And again, it shouldn't be a paper exercise, it needs to be about what's important. These are the sorts of things, just in terms of, I had that list of indicators. These are the kinds of things that we look at. Some of them are quantitative, some of them are very soft, and it's a bit of a mixture of pulling them all together. So publications, we are starting to look at other media, and I think Cameron again will talk about that later. We do use some other media, I'll show you some examples in a moment. People and training is really important and impact for us. We're interested in where people go next. Products and information, software, engagement, policy, follow-on funding, leverage of other funding is a really important thing. Awards and prizes, and this is just a sample of it. And you can go on forever having a huge basket of things that are important to you. My comment, I think, would be priority and proportionality on all of this. You can go absolutely mad collecting everything that's important. You need to, first of all, be sure that you can collect that information in a good way if it is important to you. But also you need to prioritise which are the real ones that will really tell you about impact. So that's kind of things that we try to say to our research, the people that we fund. Something that we've been experimenting with, which again we're using online stuff to do this. It's not very new method really, but we've been doing prospective career tracking of a number of our key cohorts. So certain numbers of our grants that we're funding. We've been doing an online exit survey almost, and we've got people enrolled into a panel. So if they've had a certain type of grant from us, we tell them at the start of their grant, and we remind them towards the end. We say, when you're not having any funding from us anymore, please can you tell us where you go next, and we'll send you an annual survey. And we've been doing that fairly successfully. Response rates are a little bit tricky to keep up, especially once we don't fund them, as you might imagine. And we've tried various persuasion techniques, and we do end up phoning people up if we've got their phone numbers still. And some people go, oh, hi, you've got to fill it in. Other people go, but we've still got response rates. We've been doing it for 3 years for 3 different cohorts. We've still got response rates over 85%, so they're actually pretty good. We're interested in people who've done interesting things in science. We're interested in the demographic characteristics of those people, where they've gone, have they gone overseas, why. It's a fairly short question set, but they're fairly strategic to us as a funder. What we're using those for is to feed back into if there's a particular cohort of people who are going overseas after they've had a grant from us. Is there a reason why? Is it a problem? It's not necessarily a problem, of course. In terms of new metrics and new indicators, we've been playing with a few of these things. Article level metrics, I don't know if I don't know if that exists on a lot of social science journals yet, but things like the PLOS journals, the Public Library of Science journals, so PLOS One and PLOS Medicine, they have really pushed this agenda, and we've been looking quite closely at how, as a funder, you could use that in an aggregated way. So people who are linked to papers that are having huge numbers of downloads and various bits and pieces. We're looking at those. At the moment, because of some of the reasons Rob said about your work that you did with respondents and surveys, certain people were unsure about the quality assurance on some of those metrics. I think from a funder's point of view, that's absolutely still true. but it's something that's kind of, we're watching it as a watching brief on how we can use those kind of things going forward. One thing that we have been doing, and again, I don't think this exists for the social science, but I don't know, is does anyone know about Faculty of 1,000? Is that well heard of probably in the science community, but I'm not sure about social science. It's F1000 is an organisation. It's on the web. It's basically started off with it stands for Faculty of 1,000. It's an independent company that basically initially co-opted 1,000 peer experts, so peer reviewers, to review papers that are published in the public domain and recommend ones on their website to say which papers have you read that are really interesting, or they just explore a new method. And there's about 5 different categories of the kinds of things that you would want to say that's important about a paper that's been published. The caveat on that is what's not on there, what isn't recommended, doesn't mean it's a bad paper, and you might use alternative metrics to do that, citations or whatever you might want to do. In terms of the papers that do feature on there, it's another endorsement by an expert, so it's post-peer review of a paper. We've been looking again at that because as a funder, and particularly in the biosciences, where publication on a PubMed journal is still a really good indication of knowledge progression, which is what we are about. It's a way of getting an expert post-peer review endorsement of a piece of work, but you might also have alternative metrics on as well, so citations like I mentioned. It exists for medicine and biology, and they've put the two together, and there's now more than 1,000 in the faculty, but we do use that as a tool. We started to look at that. Interestingly, on Faculty of 1,000, they've recently introduced a new feature as well, where people can submit posters to their database, and again, people are reviewing in the way that they do on the PLOS Medicine, they're reviewing posters. So it's actually another, we haven't used that particularly, but again, it's one of those ones that we're watching, because outputs that are not traditional publications are kind of really important, and that kind of is also good for some of the more junior scientists. So it's another way to sort of get that endorsement of that kind of thing. So we are looking at those mechanisms. I've been working, in terms of the third one, the clinical guidelines. In the past, it's been really tricky to get any kind of sense of where work, in terms of metrics, where work has actually had an impact on something that isn't on a database like the PubMed or like the Web of Science or something like that in terms of publications. We've now got a system working with the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, whereby all their clinical guidelines, all the citations in those guidelines are digitised, and you can search PubMed, and you can look, if we can look as a funder, if a paper that is linked to us has featured on a clinical guideline, which is really helpful as another measure. We started to do that recently. That's only been in existence since about 2010, I think. But now we've got some data that we can sort of look. We know over the last couple of years which guidelines have got Wellcome Trust linked papers on there. So we can look at, interestingly for us, the ones that we're just doing some analysis now, but the ones that we just assumed they'd all be in a lot of bioscience, traditional biosciences. But there's actually a guideline on neonatal test screening, genetic testing, and a lot of the papers on there are actually bioethics papers, which traditionally doesn't get a big feature for us. So it's actually really useful for us to show that some of the work that we funded in the ethics area is actually featured on a guideline. So that kind of work's really helpful. It's not the whole picture, but it is another metric that we've started to use, and online systems are actually helping us to do that. The other thing that we're looking at is instead of recognising the traditional sole author, the lead author or the corresponding author, to try and get a bit behind what the author list means, who's actually done the work on that paper. And in the biosciences particularly, I think in the physics community, the number of authors you see on papers is phenomenally huge. In a lot of genetics work that we do, there's over 100 authors on those papers, and the way it works at the moment is acknowledgement of funders is pretty sporadic and patchy, and it's really hard for us to know who's done what. So in an aggregated way, it seems like it would be really easy for Web of Science or someone like that to set up links to be able to do that kind of work. So you could actually look at who you funded, and again I'm talking from a funder's perspective, who's done what as well, and that's all hidden information on a paper at the moment. There's no submission with specific categories of who's done what. The PLOS journals have again played with this, but nothing's actually been taken forward yet, and I know that's something that a couple of funders are actually talking about right now, how to work and get that a bit better. The other thing that will help that is there's an initiative called ORCID, which stands for Open Researcher and Contributor ID, which is something that I think might be referred to a couple of times throughout the day, where there's an initiative that's a not-for-profit initiative with membership from publishers and funders and institutions and learned societies, all involved in trying to push forward the idea of having unique and persistent global IDs for every researcher. So what you could then do is, if you built that into all your manuscript submission system and your funding systems, you could really then start to track people and find out what they've happened and reduce reporting burdens for researchers across the world. So it's something that's really, we find is really exciting. So again, that will be referred to a few times in the day, I think. So just briefly, in terms of future agendas, these are the sorts of things that particularly my team and the Wellcome Trust and the medical research community have actually been doing a lot of thinking about. We haven't done an awful lot about a lot of these, but these are the kind of issues that we're really interested in. So in terms of evaluation or impact, we're really interested in which funding mechanism seem to work the best. So the reason why a lot of funding agencies collect this kind of information ultimately, apart from satisfying paymasters and funders, is to find out which way of funding works the best. On the ground, the research agencies, that's what we're interested in, is how to prioritise our funding and which works best. We're interested in the funding type, and what I mean by that is, should we be focusing on the basic experimental research, or should we be focusing on application-based work or technologies? Should we be all working together to make the system a bit more interlinked? Do we work best on our own? That kind of thing. The work on impact policy, practice and health, the guideline stuff is kind of one of the first sort of steps or breakthroughs in our field in that area. And in terms of impact, it's kind of I have my own issues about how to demonstrate impact of the work I've done as well. So that's kind of one of the first steps forwards there. And we are looking at things around other how to use policy documents and guidelines better in helping to demonstrate impact in the medical sector. In terms of lag times, a lot of the timeline kind of work and looking at how long it takes from a piece of research to have an impact on something, that's something that there's been a lot of interest in how long it actually takes. Is there a standard time? Can we speed it up? So that, again, in the medical research area, that's a really key thing to look at. And it's quite laborious work at the moment, but things like if you had better systems to sort of link publications to guidelines and things like that, you could start to look at timelines of how long things were taking, and you've got to start with some data and then build it up, but that's sort of the way that we're playing with some of that data to look at that. Economic analysis I'll just show you in a minute, because there has been a bit of progress there. And then, as I mentioned, all the attribution and acknowledgement issues. We are starting to work with other funders and other institutions to sort of think about how we can better isolate and look at who's done what, and so we can acknowledge everybody on the research team. So looking at contributions of individuals to research projects as well as just lead authors, and trying to recognise everybody in the research community. So just to finish on the economic analysis stuff, another quote for you. I like this quote. We use this quite a lot, and this really directly speaks to the impact agenda. It just sums it up that, yeah, we'll tell you about impact, but actually, if you think research is expensive, try paying for disease. So it's kind of like a nice kind of, not kickback, but it's kind of puts it into context. But then we haven't got the quantitative way to give the answer to that. So one of the things that has been ongoing in the last sort of 10 years, in America, based very much from the Lasker Foundation, which was funded by the lady Mary Lasker, who gave the last quote. She was a philanthropist. She left money to a foundation, and again, the Lasker Foundation funded a research report I think it was commissioned in 1999, called Exceptional Returns, and they commissioned some economists, that's the word I'm looking for, to do some specific case studies of how medical research had an impact on life expectancy in the United States, and they came up with some pretty phenomenal figures, which was softly linked to, Julie can go through if this is true, softly linked to NIH, the National Institutes of Health in America, saying that they'd received a massive increase in their budget because they could demonstrate, this was used as one of the pieces of evidence, demonstrate that their research was actually having an impact. So the Australians obviously thought, well, that's great, let's try that themselves. So they tried that, did 2 reports in a very similar methodology, and came up with huge returns for health research and development in terms of economic benefit back to Australia. So
you've got to discount that by 60% because it's Australia.
Yeah. I've lost my thread now.
Sorry.
That's all right. So it's a little joke, Australians. Yeah. So, and the methodologies, as with, I don't know if there are any economists in the room. There's a lot of assumptions in these kind of work, but what it did do, it really just laid on the table actually there are quite phenomenal benefits to health and related research compared to other fields. So we tried to do something in the UK. So the Wellcome Trust, with the Medical Research Council and the Academy of Medical Sciences, we commissioned a study in 2008 to focus specifically on 2 areas to try and look at whether the same kind of economic impact of medical research in the UK. And we picked cardiovascular disease, partly because that's where the exceptional returns work in the States was based on cardiovascular disease. So we tried to look at whether there were similar returns in a similar field in the UK, and mental health. So what we had to do was basically take research, present the amount of research that was funded over those areas over a 20-year period, and then try and track that through using various economic return models. And they basically came back with a huge return of, for every £1 you get 39 pence. For every £1 you spend on cardiovascular research over that period, you were getting 39 pence back per year. So in 3 years you've paid back your £1 and you're making money. So it was a very money-spinning enterprise. So that was the first time this had been done. Again, if you read, I've got some copies of that report with me. So if anyone wants to take there's a full report on the web, and there's some summaries which I've got here. The full report's quite for hardcore economists, which is not me. So if you're a full hardcore economist, you can have a look on the website. But I've left some copies anyway. This was, again, thought to be hugely beneficial. We had a lot of positive feedback from government circles in the UK about thank you for at least firstly making an attempt to try and do this kind of work, despite some of the caveats. And it was cited quite a lot in the House of Lords, and this was kind of one of the examples of. And again, just before the economy went really became really troubled, the Medical Research Council was fairly, I would say, I'm not sure, was sort of sheltered from some of the cuts from the spending review in that year, and they attributed some of that to the fact that we'd actually got some evidence to show that medical research actually was helping to build UK PLC as well as leading to research into medical benefits of patients and things. So that's kind of an impact of doing a study like that. So at the moment, we're actually scoping whether we do another one in a different field to look at whether the returns are similar. So we're looking at whether we do something similar in a cancer area. I don't know whether it was something you could do in social sciences as well, but there was a methodology there that you could probably replicate. So it's just an interesting new way of looking at economics and trying to find a way to actually put a value on what might be quite intrinsically difficult to put a value on. I guess that's all I want to say for now. I'm hoping that quite a lot of those issues will get raised throughout the day, and I'm quite happy to take questions and discuss or argue or whatever you'd like to do.
Thank you, Liz. So.